Welcome, everyone, to the NewVision OldWays podcast, a greatly ambitious journey of discovery where we can all learn to live better, mentally healthier, and more fulfilling lives. If you're just discovering us, feel free to go back and take the journey from the beginning. And if you're already a NewVision OldWays fan, welcome back and enjoy season
7.
And now, here is your host, Tony Marinaccio.
You are listening to NewVision OldWays, the podcast that explores timeless wisdom for the modern mind in a fun, relaxed, and most important, interactive way with you, the listener. I am your host, Tony Marinaccio, and let's get the episode started. Welcome, Visioneers, to another great episode of the NewVision OldWays podcast. And I gotta say, I was not expecting to write this particular episode right now. But current events corresponded with a book that I was reading at the moment. And, well, then this episode kind of fell right into my lap. It's amazing how that happens, right? So what book or books was it? That will be clear in a moment. But before I delve into today's subject, I want to take a quick moment and reflect back on the last episode, the slow erosion of the self and how to reverse it, and how it ultimately relates to this episode. All you have to do is turn on any news source and you can see the agenda media twisting and turning details around every corner, causing complete division in this country, while apparently the country being liberated has a different view of what's happening altogether. We cannot let anything sway our judgment of the truth, and we certainly cannot let ourselves decay in the meantime. We need to be as mentally strong as we can be to allow ourselves to see things as they really are, which is what this episode is about. It's about being able to reconcile what is happening in the Middle East before making any accusatory remarks or rash judgments. It's about understanding what is actually happening and the history that came before it, and not glossing over what a suppressive regime has done to the Iranian people. It's easy to say we should not be the aggressor here, but if people like Bruce Springsteen and Bono would stop virtue signaling for just a moment, maybe they would see what a threat to the peace of the world the Iranian regime truly is. But if you keep your rock star rose-colored glasses on too long, your vision gets distorted and you cannot see the forest for the trees. So we need to ignore the ignorance out there and try to better understand what is actually happening. And there is no better time to begin that understanding than right now with episode number 63, The Art of War and Peace, the Iranian Liberation.
For more than 4 decades, the United States and Iran have existed in a state of hostility, sometimes quiet, sometimes explosive, but always tense. It started in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Since then, relations have swung between sanctions, proxy conflicts, nuclear negotiations, cyber warfare, and the occasional direct strikes, but never full-scale war, until now. On February 28, 2026, U.S. and Israeli forces launched a coordinated strike against Iran called Operation Epic Fury.
When we look at the tensions unfolding between Iran, Israel, and the United States, and of course the entire Middle East, it is very easy to become trapped in the language of war. The headlines speak of retaliation, escalation, deterrence, and military strength. Yet history shows us that the true meaning of conflict is rarely found in the violence of the moment. Wars, revolutions, and political upheavals often reveal something much deeper about the human condition. They expose the tensions between order and chaos, between tyranny and liberty, and between the destructive instincts of power and the higher aspirations towards peace. So here on NewVision OldWays, I often like to step outside of the daily headlines and turn to ancient wisdom to better understand modern events. And few works of philosophy have endured as long as, or influenced as many leaders as, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, and its modernized companion rewrite, The Art of Peace by Philip Dunn. The original work, written more than 2,000 years ago and on bamboo strips found in a cave, Sun Tzu's work was not simply a manual for battle. It was a philosophical meditation on strategy, leadership, psychology, and human nature. Sun Tzu understood something that modern societies often forget. The most effective victories are rarely the ones that come through brute force alone. In fact, Sun Tzu warned repeatedly that prolonged war is the greatest failure of leadership. War exhausts nations, destroys prosperity, and ultimately harms the very people leaders claim to protect in many cases. The true strategist, Sun Tzu argued, seeks to win the battle before it begins by understanding the environment, the motivations of the opponent, and the deeper currents shaping events. But there is another interpretation of these ideas that speak even more directly to the world we inhabit today. In his book, The Art of Peace, author Philip Dunn takes the ancient wisdom of Sun Tzu and reframes it for the modern audience. Instead of focusing exclusively on how to defeat an enemy, Dunn explores the strategic awareness can be used to cultivate harmony, resilience, and balance in the face of conflict. In other words, the art of peace is not about weakness or passivity. It is about understanding that true strength lies in the ability to restore order rather than perpetuate destruction. One of the most important principles in the art of peace is the idea that conflict often begins long before armies ever mobilize. It begins in the mind. It begins in ideology. It begins in the narrative societies tell themselves about who they are and who their enemies must be. When these narratives become rigid and absolutist, societies begin to drift toward confrontation because they can no longer imagine coexistence. And this is the ideology Iran has been stuck in for nearly 50 years. And this is something we see clearly in the modern world. Political discourse has become increasingly tribal, both domestically and internationally. Entire populations are often reduced to caricatures by propaganda or media narratives. Yet one of the most powerful ideas in Dunn's interpretation of peace is the recognition that most conflicts are sustained by misunderstanding and manipulation rather than genuine hatred between ordinary people. When we apply this idea to Iran, for example, it becomes clear that the Iranian regime and the Iranian people are not the same thing. Iran is a civilization that has given the world poetry, mathematics, philosophy, and art stretching back thousands of years. Persian culture helped shape the intellectual and spiritual heritage of humanity. Yet the current regime governing Iran has imposed a rigid, ideological system that suppresses many of the freedoms its own people desire. Over the years, we have seen countless demonstrations by Iranian citizens demanding greater liberty, particularly by women and younger generations who want to reconnect with the broader world, but they clearly pay the price for their rights they so desire with torture, imprisonment, and many times with death. The concept of peace, therefore, is not simply about avoiding confrontation with authoritarian regimes. Sometimes peace requires confronting systems that perpetuate oppression. But even then, the objective must remain the restoration of balance rather than the revenge or domination of a society. This is where the art of peace becomes incredibly relevant to our modern moment. Philip Dunn emphasizes that real peace is not simply the absence of violence. Real peace exists when systems of power allow human potential to flourish. Peace exists when individuals are free to pursue knowledge, creativity, and spiritual growth without fear of repression. Peace exists when governments serve the well-being of their citizens rather than confronting them through fear. If we step back and examine the modern world through this lens, we begin to see how the principles of the art of peace apply far beyond the battlefield. Consider the way social media and modern technology shape public perception. In many ways, the digital age has become a battlefield of its own, one fought not with weapons, but with narratives. Misinformation spreads rapidly. Outrage is amplified, and entire populations can be manipulated into believing distorted versions of reality. Dunn's philosophy reminds us that peace requires intellectual discipline. It requires the ability to step back from emotional manipulation and examine events with clarity and humility. In that sense, the practice of peace begins with individual awareness. A society filled with citizens who cannot distinguish truth from propaganda becomes vulnerable not only to external enemies, but to internal decay. Peace, therefore, requires education, critical thinking, and a commitment to intellectual honesty, all of which Iran denies its own people. Another principle emphasized in the art of peace is the idea that strength and compassion are not opposites. In fact, they must coexist. A leader or a nation that possesses strength without moral clarity becomes tyrannical. But compassion without strength can become naive and ineffective. The balance between these forces is what allows societies to defend themselves while striving for peace. We see examples of this balance throughout history. After World War II, the reconstruction of Europe through initiatives like economic cooperation and democratic institutions demonstrated that victory in war could be followed by a deliberate effort to create lasting stability. The goal was not merely defeating an enemy, but rebuilding a system that would prevent future conflict. The same principle can apply when thinking about the future of Iran. If the authoritarian structures that currently dominate the country were ever to weaken or collapse, the objective should not be humiliation or punishment of the Iranian people. The objective should be the restoration of a society capable of reconnecting with its own rich cultural heritage and engaging with the world peacefully, which I believe is the intent of the administration. The deeper lesson here is that peace is always a long-term project. It cannot be achieved through impulsive reactions or ideological rigidity. It requires patience, strategic thinking, and a willingness to understand the humanity even of those who live under regimes we oppose. And back home, for Americans observing these global events, there is also an important personal lesson embedded in all of this. One of the reoccurring themes I explore here on New Vision Old Ways is the idea that the health of a society ultimately reflects the health of its individuals. If we allow ourselves to become consumed by fear, resentment, and tribal hostility, we contribute to the very dynamics that perpetuate conflict. But if we cultivate intellectual independence, moral courage, and emotional discipline, we help create a culture capable of navigating difficult challenges without losing its humanity. Sun Tzu understood this centuries ago when he wrote, "The greatest general is the one who wins without destroying what he hopes to govern." Philip Dunn carries this idea further by reminding us that the ultimate purpose of strategy should be the creation of peace rather than the perpetuation of struggle. And perhaps that is the most important insight for our time.
My reaction of this attack is excitement and hope for the Iranian people, for freedom and democracy in Iran. As you can see, the atmosphere is almost like a party of people being really excited. For the last 3-4 months, we've been demonstrating almost on a weekly basis for what has been happening in the atrocities inside of Iran, really the genocide against the Iranian people. And so we're excited that we may finally have an opportunity to overthrow the Iranian regime and get to a democratic country.
The world will always face moments of tension and conflict. Human history has never been free from them, but each generation has the opportunity to choose how it responds to those challenges. We could choose the path of endless escalation, fueled by anger and fear, or we could choose the more difficult path, the path of wisdom, patience, and strategic clarity. The path that understands that the highest form of victory is not domination. The highest form of victory is the restoration of peace. And if we can remember that lesson, drawn from ancient philosophy yet deeply relevant today, we may find that even in the midst of global uncertainty, there remains the possibility for renewal. Yet perhaps the most powerful insight within the art of peace is that its lessons are not limited to governments or military strategy. In fact, the deeper meaning of Dunn's interpretation is that the principles of peace must begin at the level of the individual. Nations are ultimately collections of human beings. The mindset of a society reflects the mindset of its citizens. If individuals are constantly operating from anger, resentment, and fear, Those same emotional patterns eventually shape political institutions and international relationships. Remember, the world needs a strong America, whether they like to admit it or not. And the world needs a peaceful but emotionally strong Iran to keep the peace in the Middle East. On a more personal level, think about how many conflicts in everyday life escalate simply because people feel the need to win. In workplaces and families and even among friends, disagreements often spiral into hostility because both sides become trapped in a psychological battle for dominance. Sun Tzu would recognize this pattern immediately. He repeatedly warned that the worst strategy is the one driven by emotion rather than clarity. A wise strategist understands that sometimes the greatest strength lies in stepping back, reframing the situation, and seeking resolution rather than escalation. Philip Dunn's interpretation takes this idea even further. In The Art of Peace, conflict is viewed as an opportunity to restore balance rather than to destroy an opponent. When applied to modern life, this philosophy becomes incredibly practical. Imagine approaching a workplace dispute not with the goal of humiliating a rival, but with the goal of finding a solution that strengthens the entire organization. Imagine approaching a political disagreement not with the assumption that the other side is just purely evil, but with the recognition that complex societies require ongoing dialogue and adjustment. This approach does not mean abandoning conviction. Quite the opposite. It means grounding conviction in wisdom rather than anger, or backhanded calls for violence, or name-calling, and of course, manufactured rage. Consider how this philosophy plays out in leadership. A leader guided by the principles of the art of peace understands that authority is not sustained through fear alone. True authority emerges from trust and competence. When people believe their leaders are acting in good faith and pursuing stability rather than chaos, they are far more willing to cooperate and contribute to a shared vision. This principle applies not only to the presidents or generals, but to parents, managers, teachers, and community leaders. Every sphere of life involves some form of leadership, and leadership always carries the responsibility of balancing strength with restraint.
And now, Visioneers, let's take a quick break to let you know how you can support the show. By clicking on the Patreon donate link in the show notes, or by typing in patreon.com/NewVisionOldWays, or at the NewVisionOldWays.com website, you can show your support by donating directly to the New Vision Old Ways podcast. These episodes take time and money to produce, and by donating what you are able to, it will allow us to grow the show and give you the best content that we can. Of course, you can cancel at any time. Remember, click on the Patreon donate link in the show notes, or by typing in patreon.com/NewVisionOldWays, or at the NewVisionOldWays.com website. Hint, you are able to donate a one-time lump sum. Then, cancel right after. Options are always a good thing. Thank you, and now, back to the show.
The modern world offers many examples of what happens when this balance disappears. We see political movements fueled by rage rather than thoughtful strategy. We see social media platforms amplifying false manufactured outrage because outrage generates attention and profit. Entire cultural conversations become dominated by emotional extremes that make constructive dialogue almost impossible. This is why the philosophy of the art of peace feels so relevant today. It reminds us that clarity and discipline are revolutionary acts in an age of constant distraction. The ability to pause, think carefully, and seek a path toward balance is not weakness. It is a form of intellectual courage. For Americans observing global conflicts like the tensions involving Iran, Israel, and the United States, this perspective offers a healthier way to process events. Instead of reacting with blind tribal loyalty or reflexive hostility, we can examine the situation through a strategic and philosophical lens. We can recognize that regimes and populations are not always the same thing. We can hope for outcomes that reduce tyranny while preserving the dignity of ordinary people who simply want a chance to live peaceful lives. History shows us that some of the most profound transformations occur when oppressive systems finally give way to something better. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, millions of people who had lived under authoritarian control suddenly gained the opportunity to reshape their future. Moments like that remind us that political structures can change far more quickly than we expect when the underlying conditions shift. The same possibility exists anywhere people desire freedom and dignity. But those moments of transition require wisdom. They require leaders and citizens who understand that victory must ultimately lead to stability. Without that understanding, the cycle of conflict simply repeats itself as it has with Iran for almost 50 years. This is where the ancient wisdom of Sun Tzu and the modern interpretation offered by Philip Dunn converge. Both perspectives remind us that the highest form of strategy is not destruction. The highest form of strategy is restoration. Restoration of order, restoration of human dignity, restoration of peace. And perhaps the most important realization is that peace is never something that simply appears on its own. It must be cultivated deliberately through thought, character, and discipline, which brings us to the deeper personal challenge embedded in all of this. Because while governments and armies may shape the outer world, the inner world of individuals ultimately determines the character of a civilization. If we want a society capable of peace, we must cultivate peace within ourselves. If we want leaders capable of wisdom, we must value wisdom in our own lives. If we want a future defined by stability rather than chaos, we must reject the constant temptation toward anger and division that so often dominates modern culture. The ancient philosophers understood something that we sometimes forget today. The battle between order and chaos begins inside the human mind. And that realization brings me to this thought. When you read the writings of Sun Tzu or the modern reflections found in The Art of Peace, you begin to understand that strategy is not merely about defeating an opponent. Strategy is about understanding the deeper currents that shape human behavior. It is about recognizing the power without wisdom becomes tyranny, and that peace without strength becomes fragile, something that the previous administration just could not understand. The world we live in today is filled with noise, political noise, media noise, social media outrage, endless arguments about who is right and who is wrong. But beneath that noise, the timeless questions remain. How do we confront tyranny without becoming tyrannical ourselves? How do we defend freedom while preserving our own humanity? How do we move through conflict without losing sight of the possibility of peace? Ancient wisdom does not give us easy answers, but it does give us something more valuable, a framework for thinking clearly in moments when the world feels chaotic. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, because the real battlefield is not only found in distant nations or geopolitical struggles. The real battlefield exists in the decisions we make every day, how we treat one another, how we respond to disagreement, and whether we choose clarity over chaos. If we can learn to approach life with a discipline of strategy and the humility of peace, we may discover that the most important victories are not the ones fought with weapons. The most important victories are the ones that restore balance to the human spirit, and that is a victory worth striving for. There is also another reality that must be addressed honestly when discussing the Iranian regime and the instability that has defined much of the modern Middle East. While the Iranian people themselves possess a long and remarkable cultural history, the governing structure that emerged after the 1979 Islamic Revolution has spent decades projecting power beyond its borders through militant networks and proxy groups. For many years, Iran has been designated by the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism, and the intelligence assessments from multiple governments have repeatedly concluded that Tehran has provided funding, training, weapons, and logistical support to militant organizations such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and various militia groups operating throughout Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Much of this activity has been coordinated through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its elite Quds Force. which has built a network of proxy organizations across the region capable of conducting attacks, destabilizing governments, and exerting influence far beyond Iran's borders. These groups have been involved in conflicts and terrorist attacks affecting civilians, regional governments, and Western interests alike. Over the decades, billions of dollars in financial and military support have flowed from Tehran to these organizations, strengthening their capabilities and deepening cycles of violence across the Middle East. Because of this long record of proxy warfare and militant sponsorship, many countries of international security organizations view the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iranian regime as an extremely serious global security concern. The issue is not simply the existence of nuclear technology. Many countries possess nuclear power and programs, but rather the fear that nuclear weapons in the hands of a government already engaged in destabilizing activities could dramatically increase the risk of regional war, nuclear proliferation, or coercive diplomacy. Iran has enriched uranium to levels approaching weapons-grade purity in recent years, which has intensified concerns among Western governments and regional neighbors about the potential development of nuclear weapons capability. This is why international efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons have persisted across multiple administrations and governments around the world. Sanctions, diplomatic negotiations, and international inspections have all been attempts, sometimes successful, sometimes not, to prevent the emergence of another nuclear-armed state in one of the most volatile regions on the planet. For countries like Israel, which already lives within range of Iranian-backed militant groups and missile systems, the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran is viewed as an existential threat. For the United States and many European allies, it is seen as a challenge to the broader global and non-proliferation system that has tried for decades to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. When viewed through the lens of Sun Tzu's Art of War, this situation represents a classic strategic dilemma. Sun Tzu warned that allowing a rival power to gain an overwhelming strategic advantage can lead to greater conflict later. At the same time, he also cautioned against reckless escalation that could produce unnecessary destruction. The challenge, therefore, is finding a path that neutralizes the danger while avoiding wider catastrophe. And this is where the philosophy of the art of peace becomes so important. And the opinion of sheltered, ignorant celebrities is very misguided. The ultimate objective should never be humiliation or domination of a people. The objective should be stability. It should be a Middle East where extremist militias no longer dictate the fate of nations, where civilians are not used as pawns in ideological struggles, and where the Iranian people themselves are free to participate in the global community without the shadow of authoritarian rule or international isolation. Preventing nuclear proliferation in such an environment is therefore not simply a political objective, it is a global security imperative. The stakes are not limited to any single country. Nuclear weapons in a region already defined by proxy wars, sectarian divisions, and competing military alliances could dramatically increase the probability of catastrophic conflict. In that sense, the issue is not about punishing a nation. It is about preventing a dangerous escalation that could affect millions of lives far beyond the Middle East. And if we return once again to the wisdom of the ancient strategists, we find a simple but powerful idea. The highest form of strategy is the one that prevents catastrophe before it occurs. That principle, more than 2,000 years old, remains just as relevant today, if not more. Last season, we spoke about the decay of civilizations. Last episode, number 62, we spoke about personal decay. In a time when the world is facing serious conflicts, we as a people need to learn to be stronger together. The world is watching us, and a divided nation cannot lead with righteousness and integrity. No matter what side of the political fence you reside on, our military needs our love and support. We can still have our differences, but right now, stand up for what you know is right in your heart. And that is the liberation of a people that have been held down for almost 50 years. They also need our love and support both now and after the conflict has ended. Let's give the Iranian people a taste of what true freedom can be, and let's lead by example. America is the leader of the free world. So let's act like leaders, not like a bunch of spoiled little brats who want it their way. Let's let the Iranian people see the freedom ahead, because that is what they deserve and that is what they want.
So, what did you think of this episode or any of the episodes? We would love to find out. And here is where to get a hold of the show and let us know. These are in the show notes, but as always, here they are. There is a Patreon support link in the show notes and on the NewVisionOldWays.com website that you can click on that will allow you to donate to the show and show your support. By donating what you can, it will allow us to book guests and cover costs. Anything will help. Cancel anytime. You can also message the show from each episode on your various platforms. Just look for the Send Us a Text Message link. If that doesn't work for you, you can email us at newvisionoldways@gmail.com. You can find us on what was Twitter, now X, at NewVisionOldWay, no S on that one. Check the New Vision Old Ways YouTube channel. Type in New Vision, one word, Old Ways, one word, channel, and please subscribe. It is free and will show support for the show. It really means a lot and will help grow the show on YouTube. Find us on Facebook, New Vision Old Ways, podcast you should easily find us. And as a reminder, these are still growing platforms for us and expanding all the time, so we need your help to get the flow going with the community. And last but not least, if you can do me a huge favor and subscribe to us, like us, follow us, leave a review on whatever platform you found us on. That would be so appreciated. That will also help secure guests that we will be booking in the future. So, here we are, Season 7. We have a lot to cover, so thank you for listening. We can't wait to get your input, and I also can't wait until we get together for the next episode of New Vision Old Ways. Until then, stay true to yourself, stay informed, and stay empowered.
But the most important thing is...
This episode and all the episodes of New Vision Old Ways podcast have been written, engineered, and produced by Tony Marinaccio and TKM Productions.